I'm sure you're all here tonight because you're familiar with Elliot Perlman's work. Since he won the Age short story competition in 1994, he's had a collection of short stories published, The Reasons I Won't Be Coming, and his debut novel, $3, won the Age Book of the Year, and his second, it was adapted for film as well, and his second book, Types of Ambiguity, was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, and now, 8 years later, he gives us The Street Sweeper. So, Elliot, I thought, just to start off with, you've obviously got a lot of fans here, and I thought I'd just give you the opportunity to explain 8 years. That's a long time. Why have we been waiting so long?
Yeah, I do feel like I need to explain, and maybe even apologise. Okay, well, The Street Sweeper took almost 6 years, in large part because I felt I needed to do more research for that book than for all of the previous three put together. And there was a tremendous amount of gathering of information and reading it, but then there were also the interviews that I did, and that required me to find people, firstly in New York, and get them to agree to talk to me and then conduct the interview. And then the same thing in Chicago, and then Poland, and that took a lot of time and a lot of emotional energy. I don't know whether you want to go there yet.
Yeah.
But
I can imagine.
Yeah. And also in addition to that, just for some practical reasons, because at the time I was living in New York and my books always come out here first, much to my publisher's pleasure, and then they come out overseas, and they often come out in reverse order, and so I end up sort of touring a book that I wrote years and years ago, and that takes up time.
Yeah. So you have to have your head in a few books at once if you're writing one, touring one, having a film made of another.
Well, you do suddenly think, okay, this is Germany, which book is it?
Yeah. Sorry, I should just say I was reminded that I should introduce myself, and my name's Matthia Dempsey, and I edit a magazine called Bookseller and Publisher, which is for the book trade here in Australia. So because your books are published here first, and because we review things before they come out, we had the privilege of being the first ones to review The Street Sweeper, and it got a very good review.
Thank you.
So booksellers around the country are looking forward to selling this book, and they're enjoying reading it. The novel starts with two very different characters. Lamont Williams is, he's just got out of, he's an African-American man, he's just got out of 6 years, I think it was, in prison, and he's sort of determined to hold down a job, and he's also trying to find his young daughter in New York. And then you've also got another character called Adam
Zignelik.
Thank you. Zignelik. Hopefully I'll continue to get that right. And he is also in New York. He's a historian working at Columbia University. And he's sort of facing a crisis in his professional life, but also in his personal life. He's sort of feeling like he's not living up to his promise. He doesn't quite know what he should be writing next for his next book, and he is feeling that means that his relationship should be, possibly he can't necessarily have a kid when he doesn't know what he's doing, and this is putting pressure on his relationship. So it starts with these two, and then it moves out to a much wider sort of look at their histories and a lot of movements, including the civil rights history in the in the US, and the Holocaust in Europe. And I've heard someone say that there's actually enough material here for 3 really good books. So what made you decide to put it into one? What were the seeds of this particular novel?
It had a few seeds. When I was living in New York, the first place that I lived in was across the street from this hospital, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Centre. And everybody always says that New York is a microcosm of the world, because you find in a relatively confined space, particularly Manhattan, you find people from all over the world of different races and ethnicities and nationalities, and you name it, nearly everybody is represented to some extent in New York, particularly Manhattan. Now, this hospital, which took up a whole city block, was a microcosm of Manhattan. So it had people that were patients, obviously, and because of its renown as a cancer centre, people came from all over the world to be treated there if they could. And then you would have a tremendous staff, not just the medical staff, but you would have all the people that made the hospital run, and it has a library and fundraising staff, educational facilities, and
city within a city there.
City within a city, and then you'd have all the friends and loved ones of the patients coming, and they would spill out onto the sidewalk, and they're all pretty stressed for obvious reasons, including the people that work there.
Yeah.
And the bus stop nearest me to take me from the east side of Manhattan to the west side of Manhattan was right outside the hospital. And so I used to see this disparate group of humanity all mingling, and there were people that ended up talking to each other that really should never have met, statistically. And I often think that novels begin, maybe short stories too, with some kind of question that the author feels he or she needs to answer. And the first question that arose to me was, what would happen if two people who should never have met formed an unlikely friendship? And that's the friendship between Lamont, the African-American ex-con who's looking for his daughter, and this elderly Jewish Holocaust survivor, Mr. Mandelbrot. And that was the first of a number of seeds.
Yeah, so their relationship is obviously one, and then you've got Adam as this other relationship. I was sort of, as I was reading it, there was a lot of, particularly the history of the US civil rights movement, there was a lot of history there that you really sort of brought to life on the page, particular scenes. I'm thinking of the one where the young woman, Elizabeth
Eckford?
Yeah, where she's trying to go to school in Little Rock, Arkansas, I think it was. And so she's one of these first 9 students, black students, who's trying to go to a school after these laws have been passed about segregation. And I sort of thought, how much of this is familiar to your American readers, or did you sort of want to bring this to life for people in Australia? What was the attraction for writing about that particular history?
Well, I was very aware that different readers, firstly, even different readers in Australia will have different levels of knowledge and familiarity with all of the different aspects of the whole book, and you can find Americans similarly that will know a certain amount about their own history but not that much. And I think I just had to trust an instinct that a certain amount of information was necessary but not too much. And I hope there isn't too much, and I've tried to it's always in the service of the story, at least that's the intention. And you do want to elicit emotion. So otherwise it would just be, a recitation of facts.
Yeah.
But I know there will be things that about American history that American readers will know that Australians didn't. But it is surprising. I know, we all say Americans know a lot about themselves and think a lot about themselves, but it's still surprising what they don't know.
Yeah, and not necessarily about all their history or...
Yeah. I've even had some American readers tell me already that they didn't know certain things.
I'd heard that. I heard you said there were some New Yorkers who you would think of all the people in the world would claim to know the most about their city that said they'd learned some stuff from the book that they hadn't known about their own city before.
Yeah, that was gratifying.
That's quite a compliment, isn't it? Yeah. I guess the other thing that I wondered was, you've got these 2 stories. You've got the American civil rights history that sort of, you're hearing about characters unfolding in that time, living through the changes that were part of that movement. You've also got this older man in hospital who's telling Lamont the story of his experience, and his experience is as a Holocaust survivor. What did you see were the links between those 2 stories? How did you feel like they could come together and have similar themes?
Well, it's firstly, there are the obvious parallels. These are two groups of people that have suffered tremendously, but it has the added flavour, if you like, or I won't find the right word, but it has the added attraction that they're people who wouldn't know very much about each other's suffering. And because it's New York, they can come together. So that was definitely an attraction. But particularly for Lamont and the elderly Holocaust survivor, whose name is Mr. Mandelbrot, they help each other because, in a sense, Lamont is trying to survive. I mean, he's not a victim of a totalitarian regime, but he's trying to make it through every day in order to get his life back on track and to be able to stabilise his life, his income, and to be able to find his daughter, which is incredibly important to him. And so he's living on a knife's edge all the time, particularly because America, and even a liberal state like New York, has labour laws that it's what is called an at-will state, which means that people can be fired at will. You don't need to have done something wrong, and reasons don't have to be articulated. That was a bit of a shock to me because I thought New York was a bit more liberal than that, but no. In fact, the closest they come to it was the then Attorney General, who was Elliot Spitzer, who's gone on to become famous for other reasons. He put on the website of the Attorney General's department almost like an apology, saying you need to know this. That you can be fired at will. So
at least they're aware that
at least people are aware of it.
What that would do to them. Like maybe it's better not to know. You're not stressed the whole time then.
But so there is this link between obviously the Holocaust survivor, Mr. Mandelbrot, has faced life and death danger. And at times so has Lamont, but Mr. Mandelbrot suffered it as part of the worst that man has ever done to man, and Lamont's not in that position. But they do have in common the idea of surviving and having suffered not because of anything they've done, but because of who they are.
Yeah.
And there's a kindness in Lamont that immediately strikes the interest of Mr. Mandelbrot. And what seems to affect Lamont is that this old man Mandelbrot's not scared anymore. And Lamont gets tremendous courage from this. And this old man has a twinkle in his eye and seems to know a whole lot that you wouldn't expect a man that would otherwise be disregarded or written off as just an old man with a foreign accent. When you think about their relationship, I remember when I first started reading it, they meet because Lamont is kind and does sort of break a rule to take this Mr. Mandelbrot up to his room. But you did a really good job of already kind of creating the feeling that Lamont has that he's really on a knife edge, with this position. And so when he was about to break the rules, I'm like, no, Lamont, don't do it. Because I'm thinking he's going to lose his job and then he can't keep searching for his daughter. So you had me on side with him, but then you also had me being this goody two-shoes of like, just leave the old man. And I thought, what does that say about me? That, I wanted him to just... If he hadn't done that, then everything would have gone very, very differently. And so it really did work in his favour. So kindness got him there. It does obviously deal a lot with Mr. Mandelbrot's experience of the Holocaust, and he's a member of the Sonderkommando, is that how you say it? Sonderkommando.
Sonderkommando, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, one of the death camps. And he experiences this absolute horror of being forced to assist in sort of the disposal of the bodies of the people that have been murdered there. So, there's some really horrific descriptions of stuff that we have heard before, but which affects you anew every time, I guess, that you come across these stories. And it occurred to me that in your first two novels, you've had characters who the Holocaust and the experience of Europe in the 30s and 40s has really haunted those characters, even though they've been living here in Australia. And it's always the idea of the Holocaust and that experience has been at the periphery of some of these books that you've already written. But here it's very much front and centre, and you're having to really look it in the face and deal with the experience. And I just wondered, was it something that you felt you had to work your way up to as a writer?
That's a really good question. I think now that you've forced me to think of the answer, probably yes. It wasn't a conscious thing. I didn't know that I needed to work my way up to it, but on the one hand, I think because of my background, and I don't just mean because I'm Jewish or even because my grandparents lost most of their family in the Holocaust, but also because my parents brought me up. I mean, I don't remember a time when I didn't know about the Holocaust, albeit as I got older I learned more about it. But I guess I always knew that sooner or later I would be writing about it, but it wasn't a conscious thing that I needed to write X number of books before getting there.
No, I did mean it in the more, your own state and your own attitude towards it.
I think I probably needed the confidence of a few books under my belt because, really, I mean, the truth is that language is not just my capacity with language, but anyone's. Even I think Primo Levi said this, that language can only approximate the experience of what happened. It's not powerful enough to really give it to you. In fact, he went further and said that if you survived it, you didn't fully experience it. So if he could say that, I don't feel too embarrassed admitting that I needed to work my way up to it.
It's interesting you said that about that Primo Levi quote, that if you survive it, you didn't experience it, because in this story, one of the characters, Dr. Border, Henry Border, goes to what were called the displaced persons camps in Europe immediately after the war. And he wants to speak to and record the stories of people there who have experienced the Holocaust. And as it sort of shows with the scene in the book, at that stage, these people, there was no name for that. Now we know these people were Holocaust survivors, but of course, no one really knew much about what had happened. And so he goes to these camps, DP camps they're called, and he sort of says, I want to record these stories. And he gets told by the people running them, so-and-so, his story has done the camp. It's an exceptional story. And this doctor says, no, I don't want the exceptional stories. I want the rank and file stories. I want the ones that are not the exception. But it's interesting that you say that actually even just being there, being alive, was an exception to the rule.
That's right, because the rule was you were meant to be killed. So if you weren't killed, something exceptional happened. That's why if you read any accounts of Holocaust survivors, or you know any, the stories they tell are remarkable because they had to be. If they weren't remarkable, they would have perished.
I sort of wondered in writing this whether you were looking as well at some of the parts of those stories that we haven't necessarily heard as many times before. I'm thinking of, for example, the uprising of the Sonderkommando in the camp, where they did actually fight back at one point. I haven't tended to hear so many stories about that kind of action in the camps. I just wondered if you could tell a little bit about that and why you thought that was important.
Well, I'm always... I never know which way to go here because I want to talk about it, but I don't want to give too much of the plot away.
No, of course, sorry.
But no, you haven't done anything wrong.
Good.
But what I can tell you is that there was resistance in the camp, and I did a lot of research on this, and I felt also that it's not sufficiently known. And although my primary objective is to tell the best story I can, but since it's such an incredible story, the two aims met, which is both to tell the best story I can, but also to try and shine a light on the deeds of these people, because what they did was just astonishing, absolutely remarkable. And I was fortunate enough I mean, I had never been to Poland. My grandparents were Polish and Russian Jews, and they came to Australia in the late 20s. And, you know, had they not, I wouldn't be talking to you now. And they lost, you know, pretty much everybody, and none of our family had been back to Poland since then.
Right.
And I knew I was going to have to go there, and I had read about a kind of flowering or renaissance of interest in Jewish culture in Poland, particularly in Krakow. And Krakow is a beautiful city that wasn't destroyed, fortunately, when the Nazis invaded, because they wanted to make that the regional capital. They didn't destroy it, unlike Warsaw, which was, you know, completely destroyed.
Yep.
And then when the Soviet Union won it back, they didn't destroy it either. So you had this incredibly beautiful ancient city, and within it I'd read about a flowering of interest in Jewish culture. So there were Jewish bookshops and Jewish cafes and restaurants and even some Yiddish theatre, but it was all being put on and orchestrated and assisted by Poles who were not Jewish, because at the beginning of the war, 10% of the Polish population was Jewish, and 90% of them were annihilated. So by the time you know, this Australian gets there doing his research, there are no Jews, not statistically, there are no Jews to speak of, but there is this little community of people, usually young Poles, but not always, who are very interested in that part of what they consider to be their own culture. So I sort of parachuted myself down into Krakow and started to try and infiltrate this community of Jew-loving Poles. And I told some people that I wanted to go to Auschwitz, but not just as a tourist, that I was a writer and that I felt I was going to have to write about it, and I wanted to I wanted the Rolls Royce of Auschwitz-Birkenau guides. And the name that kept getting whispered to me was this man, Robert Novak. And Robert was an employee. He's Polish, a young man, because he's younger than me. Anyone younger than me is very young. And he had a full-time job as an employee of the Auschwitz State Museum, but he had a reputation of being particularly good, and I met him and convinced him to sort of take me on, and we ended up working together over 6 visits, and he went from being a trusted guide to a very dear friend. And he did more than that for me, which is already enough, but what he did, when I told him more of the plot than I'm giving away now,
give everyone else
he said that he thought he could find for me, well, he knew he could find a man, and he thought he could convince the man to talk to me, and the man was the last surviving Polish Jewish member of the Sonderkommando. And as you've said, the Sonderkommando were those prisoners who were forced on pain of immediate death, as opposed to everybody else that was, you know, had no choice in it. He was given a choice: you can work in the gas chambers and crematoria, or we can kill you now. That's the deal. And as you can imagine, they kept turning over the Sonderkommando, so there'd be a number of men working in this detail, this unbelievably gruesome detail, and then they would be tricked and annihilated. And then new prisoners would come, and they chose the strongest or the largest, or, you know, they had their quite sort of crude methods of determining who should be a member. And you know, since there are not many Holocaust survivors with us at all now, the number of members of the Sonderkommando is even smaller. And Robert had found this man and got him to agree to talk to me. And I think the last time I was in Poland was March, April of 2008, and the man died shortly after that, a few months later. And it was this man's experience that became the basis of the wartime experience of my Mr. Mandelbrot, who befriends Lamont in Manhattan.
They share the same first name, was it Henrik? Or
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned Robert Novak, I think you said his name was, because I saw in your acknowledgements that you thanked him and you said that he's living proof that his hometown of Auschwitzen, I'm not sure how you say it, Auschwitzen, is not Auschwitz. And so I guess what exactly did that mean to you to say that?
Right. Well, one of the things Robert taught me very early on is there is a town in Poland called Oświęcim, which is 1,000 years old or maybe more, and the Nazis chose this site as the place to build what we now know as Auschwitz or Auschwitz-Birkenau. But from his point of view as a Pole, it's a little bit like we're in Melbourne and a foreign nation invades Melbourne and builds the largest killing facility in the history of the human species and calls it Melbourne or something along the lines of Melbourne. And for the rest of eternity, people associate our hometown with that killing facility. And so he taught me very quickly that he and his family, his parents and his grandparents, they come from Oświęcim. They don't come from Auschwitz.
It's not a bad place, yeah.
And he told me even that, his grandparents who lived there during the war, they could smell the burning on a bad day, so he was intimate. I mean, he wasn't alive then, but he has direct family experience, and he could give me all sorts of tiny details that you probably can't get from books. One that I have said to other people is that I went, 6 times, and sometimes it was summer and sometimes it was winter, and once we were standing in winter at the ruins of Crematorium 4, and it started to snow, and it's very pretty, the snow is, and we would have long periods of silence. He would tell me something and I'd look at it and walk around. We might not talk for 10 or 20 minutes. And the snow started to come down, and I said, it must have been like this sometimes. And he nodded or said, yeah. And then I added, almost sotto voce, except that there would have been ash mixed with the snow. And he heard me and he said, no. And I said, well, what do you mean, no? And he said, well, where we are... Well, first he said, I know why you say that. You say that because you saw it in the movie Schindler's List. And I thought for a moment, I said, yeah, that probably is why I say that. And he said, no, if you think about it, that wouldn't have happened because where we are is too far for ash that is as heavy as ash from human bodies would be. It's not paper or cardboard, so it's heavier, it wouldn't float that far. It's a tiny detail, it doesn't change the plot, it doesn't change anything, but if you've got somebody like that metaphorically holding your hand, you feel a lot more confident to write about this.
Yeah.
I was very lucky.
Sounds like it. This book, the character Adam, he's a historian, and it sort of ends up in parts. It's a bit of a paper chase mystery. I mean, he's doing a lot of research, he's interviewing different people, he's accidentally finding things that help him with this search. And part of the search that he's on is to try to work out or prove whether black American soldiers were there at the liberation of one of the camps, one of the camps that were part of the Holocaust. Did his experience of research and following people and doing interviews, did that sort of reflect your own? And did you want to find or see a connection between the experience of black soldiers going into Europe to fight the war and then them coming back and being part of the civil rights movement? Did you sort of draw connections there? I
wasn't looking to find an answer. I'll go back and explain how I became aware that there was a documentary made about, okay, I'll go back even further. The US military was segregated until 1948 when Truman decided, you know, enough was enough. But during the Second World War, there were black troops used for any purpose. They could be used to fight, and they could also be used to tend the officers' mess. And, you know, units would be split up. And there was a documentary made in the early 90s for PBS, public television in the States, about the role of black troops in the liberation of Dachau. And there was a huge uproar from a disparate group of people, white people, saying this didn't happen, they weren't there. And this fascinated me for two reasons. Firstly, if African Americans weren't there, why would they lie and say they were there? I mean, there is enough evidence of them performing heroic deeds as soldiers in a number of wars, including the Second World War, so they don't need to invent it. On the other hand, if they were there, why would so many whites be so desperate to prove that they weren't there? And how offensive is that? And, you know, what used to happen is that, leaving aside the question of Dachau for a moment, you'd have African American soldiers who would be sent in to liberate streets, and they would engage in hand-to-hand combat with the Nazis, and they'd win, and they'd take back the streets for the Americans and for all the Allies, and then they'd be prohibited from using those streets because they're black. So
a lot of ironies going on in a segregated, you know, a segregation on the basis of race going to fight Nazis.
That's right. So you had, you know, they were fighting the most racist regime, you know, known, and they were victims of tremendous racism themselves, and it had to inform how many of them felt when they came back, because so many of their deeds were heroic. It instilled a certain self-confidence in them, because, as you know, we can all imagine, but we don't often think about it, if a group of people or even individuals are put down often enough, they start to believe it, and they start to have a view of themselves as being a little bit, or maybe even a lot, the way their oppressor views them. And their experience in the Second World War proved to them, if they needed it, and I'm not saying that they all needed it, but that they could match it with anybody. And so when they got back to the United States, they weren't willing to step off the pavement and say, you know, good morning, sir, and for grown men to be referred to as boy. You know, they wouldn't take that anymore. And the particular significance of Dachau is that it's the earliest. It's when Hitler came into power in 1933. That's practically the first thing he did. He set up this concentration camp, and since he had so many people he didn't like, so many categories of people he didn't like, he put them in Dachau. So it was of particular significance if black troops were part of the liberation of that concentration camp, which is just outside of Munich. You know, it stands for something. And so spooked were the producers of the documentary that they pulled the documentary, and it wasn't shown. You can't buy it. I've never been able to see it. And I did, and this doesn't give too much of the plot away, I did what Adam did, and I contacted the US military historian. It was really an office, and I put the question to them, and they, you know, were there or were they not black troops present at the liberation of Dachau? And their official answer was, we can neither confirm nor deny that there were black troops present. So the truth is, I mean, obviously, you know, pathetic, bleeding heart liberal, I want to say they were there. I don't know that they were there. I've seen black veterans interviewed talking about it, and if they weren't there, they're incredibly good actors.
Yes, yeah. when you think about that segregation in the army and a lot of the other occurrences that you bring to life, like the 9 school children trying to go to school, and I'm also thinking of there's a section where you talk about a black school teacher who just sort of says hey to the sort of local, I don't know, the mayor or someone.
This is Emmett Till.
Was it? It was about the school buses. Just a sort of short segment where you sort of explained that this man sort of pointed out that there's X number of school buses for these white students and sort of precisely 0 for the black students, and hey, can we do something about that? And I can't remember exactly what you described was done to him, but he had just had a hate campaign against him basically, and had to give up his job and leave, and it was horrific. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, all through that civil rights movement, there's a lot to do with the law, of laws being passed, and it just seemed very obvious that this is a racist country, there's a racist laws, and this is what you do about it. It seemed quite sort of cut and dry in retrospect, perhaps. But then I sort of thought about this character that you've created, Lamont, who, there's nothing enshrined in law that's been against him. But he's still suffering, it seems, from inherent racism in that country. So I sort of just wondered what you thought about, is it actually harder now? As you've got rid of, as the lawyers have been in and done their work, then where do you go? It's a bit more ambiguous after that.
I think it's better. I think it's easier now than it was in the 40s and 50s and 60s, definitely. But you're right. While there is the law to fall back on, you can't stop. It's the same, to put it in a banal context. If there are 3 people in the room, one person has a good chance of being excluded, and if one of them stands out obviously from the other 2, that's likely to be the one that's going to be excluded. And look, so much so, I mean, is there this, race is still so important that you even find black people discriminating against black people. And there's a lot that's talked about in the black community, and I'm no expert on this, I should say, but the black women, and you see this in the novel, often prejudge black men because they bought into... Well, firstly, it is true that, African American men are overrepresented in all of the worst statistics, but that's led a lot of black women to prejudge black men, and we see right from part 1 on the bus, Lamont,
his experiences,
is a bit of a victim of that.
Yeah, I think you also talk about. So there's a father-son theme running through this book as well between the main characters and some of the characters and their relationships with their fathers. But a friend of Adam's, Charles, he and his father have some very good, interesting conversations and arguments. And William, the father, is a great character. He's sort of never giving up the good fight. But he has an argument with his son about Ahmadinejad, say it, yeah, coming to Colombia and things that actually happened. And he's very angry about some of these things that have happened on the campus at Columbia. I think one was a black teacher, professor, having a noose left on her door. And he talks about this Supreme Court judge, Clarence Thomas, yeah. And, so this is a black character having an absolute rant at this other Supreme Court judge who also happens to be black. So you sort of have touched on some of those issues that come up.
Clarence Thomas is... I think the character... William refers to him as the plantation owner's favourite Negro. So maybe I should just leave it there.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed about their relationship is that in the course of their argument, William sort of it becomes known or obvious that William doesn't necessarily think that his son is applying himself or using his skills in the best possible way. His son is a historian who's writing papers, and he sort of implies, you should be doing a whole lot of other stuff. Basically, you should be continuing the sort of activism that I used to do, son. What are you wasting your time for? And I sort of thought, is that legitimate criticism, or do we need to recognise that there are different people with different skills? We're in a bit of an ecosystem, and you're going to do what you can do in your sphere that's helping sort of the overall game, or is that a cop-out? How do you, you're a writer.
Yes, I'm a writer, so
that's your job.
Cop-outs.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not suggesting a right answer in that battle, but it was important to me to show the tension between the father and the son. And what I tried to do, and I've tried to do this in other books as well, is to construct an argument where, as the reader's reading it, he or she thinks, yeah, that's right. And then you hear the retort, you read the retort and you think, no, that's a point. And then you keep going backwards and forwards, because that is an interesting argument. So have I got out of having to answer whether I can...
Yeah. Look, I think it's time that I open up to questions from all you guys. So we've got a few minutes here. So if anyone, we've got people with roving mics, as they're called. So if anyone has any questions, if you can just put your hands up so that we can see, we'll get to you. Looks like a shy group of people at the moment. We have one in the middle and one gentleman down the front here as well. Hands up for a moment till the microphones can see you. Yep, just here, and then in the middle at the back as well. And just before you speak, sir, sorry, if I can just remind everyone that we're here to ask questions of Elliot, not to give comments, lengthy comments of our own. Okay.
Nevertheless, I'd like to begin with a comment, and that is that, Elliot, I can't wait to read this book. I loved 7 Types of Ambiguity, so that really whet my appetite. My question relates to something you said a moment ago about the proportion of Jews still in Poland, and I had heard that statistic too, and I'd always interpreted that in terms of the residual anti-Semitism in the country, rather than there simply not being enough Jews left. What do you have a view on that?
Look, it's actually, even post-war Polish Jewish history is complex. Look, there is a tremendous history of anti-Semitism in Poland, and it's not over. For example, on one of my visits, there is a block of flats. Robert and I would park in the car park. It's a very mundane thing, but you have to park somewhere to go there. You park in the car park, and across the street, there's a block of flats being built, which on land which used to be Auschwitz. Because the other thing a lot of people either forget or maybe never knew is that Auschwitz and all of the over 40 sub-camps occupied a territory that was just under half the size of Manhattan. So it was huge. It was the city of slave labour and death. And in this block of flats, on this construction site, there was a noose drawn on the bricks with Magen David, a Star of David, and a swastika beside it. And it's just sort of astonishing. And Robert, I knew that he'd seen it, and I knew that he was hoping I hadn't seen it, and I knew he was ashamed. The other thing to say is that since Jews were in Poland for approximately 1,000 years, and this point was made to me by the head of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and I think he's an ordained rabbi, and he told me, Jews were here for 1,000 years, it can't have all been bad. And even in the Holocaust, you hear stories of incredible bravery. And it also needs to be remembered that any Pole that risked their life for, that tried to save a Jew could have been rewarded with death for him or her and their family. So it's basically, you can find examples, whatever you're looking for, you'll find it. You'll find examples of Poles turning the Jews in when if a Jew was hiding. You'll find examples of Poles not doing anything but being happy that the Jews had been led away. You find examples of Poles doing nothing but being traumatised at what they saw happening to their neighbours, and then you'll find examples of Poles risking their lives to save Jews. And the history, it didn't stop with the Second World War. There were pogroms against Jews who were returning from the camps. There has been a little bit of an influx of Jews from the former Soviet Union since Poland was considered to be, perhaps more west than where they were coming from, and not too far away for them to get to. So, numerically it probably has risen a little bit, but, not to the level it was before the war.
I know we do have other questions. Yep, there's 1, 2, and there's one in the middle, halfway, middle. Yep, both arms up then. I know you had your hand up first.
It's a good question about how do you choose the names for your characters, if you may reveal?
Well, with Lamont, I wanted a name that was a common name for a black man of that age, so that was relatively easy to research. With Adam, we haven't even said he's Australian.
Yes, sorry, I didn't say that.
He's actually from Melbourne.
He's got an Australian accent and it's popular over there.
And he comes back to Melbourne. I chose Adam, I think, because it's the name of the first man. So it seemed a good name for him. No one's going to believe me about this, but it's true. There is, in the novel, Adam's best friend Charles is married to a beautiful black woman called Michelle. And no one's going to believe that
their child's name?
That it's not Michelle Obama.
Yeah.
I started writing the book. I'd already heard of Obama when he was a junior senator for Illinois, but I didn't know anything about his wife. I think I'm not very good at choosing names generally. I have trouble with it. So that's an interesting question.
And some of the characters were, it seemed to be based on some true characters as well. So you've taken some liberties but kept some names. Yeah.
I mean, for example, there's a character who makes an appearance called Emanuel Ringelblum, and he's a real person.
Yeah.
He was a very heroic historian of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he collected an archive, and I didn't have to make that name up.
Yeah.
And then sometimes for characters that are in the camps, I wonder how this is going to sound. I bought a book in Germany, or maybe it was in Poland, which is a record as near as possible of the name of every person killed in Majdanek. Majdanek was another death camp, also in Poland, near Lublin. And when I needed a name for a character, I took names from that book.
Yeah. Just on the character that you mentioned, or the real life character who was a historian in the ghetto, you can probably see here, there's a lot in this book that sends you, if you haven't already read it, it sends you to Wikipedia and to, you're like, oh, I must look that up, I didn't know about that. So that's what all those notes are about. So I when I read that part about that historian, I thought, oh, hang on, was he a real person? Looked him up. Fascinating story. So you do a lot of that.
We have to be careful of Wikipedia, you know.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, read it at your own risk. But there's someone halfway down at the back there that I think was waiting, and then a lady just in the front here on the side. Yep.
Hi, my name's Deborah, and I also enjoyed very much your earlier books, so I'm looking forward to a little bit of escapism with this one as well. You mentioned earlier that you'd been living in New York, and you probably have a bit of a tour with the new book now, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to these days? Are you still working as a barrister?
No, short answer is no. Technically I am still a barrister. I could, legally I'm entitled to take a case tomorrow, but I haven't taken a case in about 10 years. You wouldn't want to be my first client to have to go back. I was working as a judge, as an associate. I was an associate to a Supreme Court judge when I wrote $3, and then I went to the bar to become a barrister, and that's where I wrote the short stories. And then I had the good fortune of being able to interest a New York agent, and the New York agent led me to get my work translated, and that enabled me, at least, you know, so far, to support myself solely as a writer. And, you know, I think particularly with, especially the Street Sweeper, but even with 7 Types of Ambiguity, I couldn't have written those books part-time, I don't think. And even though, you know, it probably still takes me too long to write them, if I had to do them part-time, I'm not sure I could do it at all.
There's a question, there was a woman just down here in the front as well, who had her hand up earlier.
I'm halfway through your book and absolutely loving it. But my question is about, I know the Holocaust is close to you, close to your heart, and obviously social justice is also close to your heart. Writing about such big themes, how has that actually changed you? I'm curious about that.
I think it's aged me. Well, you know, I'm trying to remember the name of the historian. I'm going to try and say it, and if I get it wrong, I apologise to her. I think her name is Atina Crossman, and she wrote something, and I'll paraphrase, and so I won't be doing her justice, but she wrote about the simultaneous imperative to tell and the impossibility of telling. And it struck me, and that plus reading Primo Levi about writing about the Holocaust made me, in a sense, it freed me up, because I knew that, I mean, okay, you know, I could get it wrong very easily, but I can't possibly take the reader right there. So, since language can't, and so that was, I don't know if this sounds perverse, but sort of liberating. And the truth is, these issues, you know, have been on my mind. I think about this stuff and read about it anyway. Not you know, not only and not to the exclusion of everything else, but so I felt like, you know, I've finally done it. I've finally written about it. So I don't know if it's changed me, but it's given me some relief, sense of relief, I think. It's a good question, but because I haven't thought about it, so I give you this garbled answer, because I'm trying to answer it for myself as I say it.
We're out of time now. Thank you, Elliot. I think we're all glad that you've aged by writing these books. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but we're glad that you've put yourself through whatever it takes in order to write these books. And I was just thinking, I was rereading $3 in preparation for this, and I don't know, those of you who've read $3 will know that the central character meets a woman once every 9.5 years. And I sort of thought, well, I guess, you know, if we get a book every 8 years, then that's a bit better than he had. So, yes, thank you for writing it. Thank you all for coming. And I believe that Elliot's going to be signing some books after this session down the back. So if you've got your book, take it along, or if you want to buy one, he'll be signing. Thank you all very much. Put your hands together for Elliot.
Thank you.